January 14th, 1945. The engine of Lieutenant Colonel Elwyn Righetti's P-51 Mustang thundered through the frozen air over eastern Germany. Below him, a ribbon of track unwound through snow-dusted fields, and on it, a freight train crawled westward like a wounded animal desperately seeking shelter. The locomotive at its head belched black smoke that hung in the still air, marking its position for miles. Righetti pushed the stick forward, dropping katydid toward the earth at 300 miles per hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission briefing that morning at Royal Air Force Wormingford in England had been straightforward. Escort heavy bombers to targets near Leipzig, then hunt for targets of opportunity on the way home. Trains, trucks, airfields, anything that moved supplies toward German forces still fighting in the Ardennes. By January of 1945, the Reich's transportation network had become its jugular vein, and American fighter pilots had learned exactly where to cut. Righetti leveled off at 100 feet, the ground screaming past beneath katydid's wings. Through his gun sight, he could see the locomotive's engineer, probably releasing steam pressure to prevent the boiler from exploding under attack. Standard procedure. The man knew what was coming. At 400 yards, Righetti squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted with a sound like tearing canvas, 3 in each wing, firing 13 rounds per second. The convergence point for all 6 weapons was 300 yards directly ahead of his propeller. The bullets arrived before the sound. Tracers walked across the locomotive's boiler, stitching a line of impacts that sparkled in the winter sunlight. The boiler held for 2 seconds, then burst with a violence that Righetti felt through his airframe. Superheated, steam exploded upward in a white column that obscured the entire train. He pulled up hard, 4 Gs pressing him into his seat, banking right to watch the destruction. The locomotive had stopped, steam still venting from multiple ruptures. Behind it, freight cars bunched together as the train's momentum died. 1 locomotive destroyed. 21 more, and he'd match the impossible claim that had been circulating through fighter groups since the previous week. Some pilot, the stories said, had destroyed 22 locomotives in a single strafing run. Righetti didn't believe it. He'd destroyed more locomotives than any other pilot in the 8th Air Force. 27 confirmed ground victories, most of them trains, and he knew the mathematics made such a claim impossible. But the story persisted, passed from pilot to pilot in ready rooms across England. 22 locomotives in one run. It was the kind of tale that revealed more about what these missions demanded than about what actually happened. Because the truth about train strafing was more complex, more brutal, and more important than any exaggerated claim could capture. The truth was written in the mathematics of ammunition capacity, the physics of steam boilers under pressure, and the casualty lists that grew longer with every railroad rodeo mission. To understand why pilots told stories about destroying 22 locomotives, you need to understand what actually happened when a P-51 pilot dove toward a German freight train in the winter of 1945. You need to understand the weight of the ammunition, the range of the guns, the speed of approach, and the seconds available to aim. You need to understand that ground attack was the deadliest mission. American fighter pilots flew, more dangerous than bomber escort, more deadly than air-to-air combat. You need to understand that Elwyn Righetti, the man who destroyed more locomotives than any other 8th Air Force pilot, would be missing in action within 3 months. And you need to understand that the exaggerated stories about impossible numbers of destroyed trains served a purpose. They turned an ugly, grinding war of attrition into something that sounded heroic. They transformed missions where pilots died attacking railroad yards into tales of supernatural marksmanship. They made train strafing sound like precision surgery instead of what it actually was. A meat grinder that consumed both machines and men in pursuit of a single strategic goal, strangling Germany's ability to move supplies. The campaign that produced these stories, and that killed Elwyn Righetti, began in earnest in December of 1944. The German offensive in the Ardennes, what Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, had caught Allied forces off guard. German armour had pushed deep into Allied lines, creating a salient that threatened to split American and British forces. The Wehrmacht's advance depended entirely on captured Allied fuel supplies, because Germany's own petroleum production had been devastated by strategic bombing. But moving reinforcements, ammunition, and what little fuel remained required a functioning railroad network, and that network became the primary target for Allied fighter groups across England. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, authorized fighter groups to pursue ground targets aggressively after completing bomber escort duties. What emerged was a campaign of systematic destruction that pilots called railroad rodeos. The name suggested cowboys and adventure. The reality involved flying at treetop level through flak while trying to hit moving targets with weapons designed for air-to-air combat. The 55th Fighter Group, based at Wormingford, earned the nickname Loco Busters for their effectiveness against German locomotives. Their distinctive green and yellow checkerboard markings on engine cowlings became associated with train destruction. By January of 1945, the 55th had destroyed more locomotives than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They would ultimately claim over 600 confirmed locomotive kills. 170 of those kills came in just 2 days of operations. Lieutenant Colonel Elwyn Righetti commanded the 55th Fighter Group during this period. He was 29 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of his pilots were barely 22. Righetti had joined the group in October of 1944 with extensive flight experience but zero combat experience. Within 4 months, he'd become the group's commanding officer and the leading ground attack ace in the European theatre. His official tally stood at 7.5 aerial victories and 27 ground victories. The ground victories were almost all locomotives. Righetti's approach to train hunting was methodical. He understood what many pilots learned too late. Locomotive strafing required different tactics than air-to-air combat. In dogfights, pilots aimed ahead of their target, leading the enemy aircraft to account for closing speeds. Against locomotives, the target was effectively stationary relative to a fighter traveling 300 miles per hour. What mattered was ammunition management, angle of attack, and escape route. A standard P-51D Mustang carried 1,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across 6 machine guns. At typical combat rates of fire, those rounds lasted 24 seconds of continuous firing. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 2 to 4 seconds to manage barrel heating and conserve ammunition. Against a locomotive, effective damage required at least 4 seconds of concentrated fire. That meant a pilot could engage, at most, 6 separate targets before running dry. 6 locomotives. That was the theoretical maximum for a single sortie if every burst was perfectly aimed, if every locomotive was isolated and vulnerable, if no anti-aircraft fire disrupted the attack runs. In reality, pilots averaged 1 to 2 confirmed locomotive kills per mission when they found targets. Destroying 6 locomotives in a single mission was exceptional. Destroying 22 was physically impossible unless the pilot was flying multiple sorties or counting damaged locomotives as destroyed. But the physics weren't the only limiting factor. The locomotives themselves were remarkably resistant to machine gun fire. A typical German freight locomotive weighed 80 to 100 tons. The boiler, the primary vulnerable component, consisted of steel plating between 15 and 25 millimeters thick. A 50 caliber round could penetrate that armor, but penetration alone wasn't enough. The round had to rupture the boiler in a way that caused catastrophic failure. Steam locomotives operated under pressure between 200 and 250 pounds per square inch. That pressure turned water into superheated steam that drove the engine's pistons. It also meant the boiler was essentially a controlled bomb. When bullets ruptured the boiler plating, the pressure differential caused explosive decompression. Superheated steam vented through the holes at supersonic velocities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If enough holes opened simultaneously, the boiler could fail catastrophically, tearing itself apart. That's what pilots saw in their gun camera footage and what made the dramatic images they described in debriefings. locomotives exploding in clouds of white steam, tracks buckling from the force of the blast, debris scattered across the railbed. It looked devastating. It was devastating. But achieving that result required precise shooting under conditions that made precision nearly impossible. The attacking pilot had to approach low enough to get below German radar coverage, typically 100 feet or less. At that altitude, flying at 300 miles per hour, the ground was a blur. The pilot had perhaps 2 seconds from target identification to weapons release. During those 2 seconds, he had to account for his own aircraft's motion, the curvature of his bullet trajectory, the position of the locomotive relative to the track, and the location of the most vulnerable points on the boiler. He also had to watch for flak. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had begun mounting 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns on flat cars behind locomotives. These mobile flak batteries travelled with priority trains, waiting for attacking fighters. The guns fired explosive shells designed specifically to destroy aircraft. A single hit could bring down a P-51, and the gunners had learned to hold their fire until the fighter committed to its attack run when evasive manoeuvres were impossible. Righetti knew all of this. He'd flown enough railroad rodeo missions to understand the arithmetic of survival. Attack the locomotive first, before the flak gunners could react. Use a shallow dive angle to maximize time on target. Fire in short bursts to maintain control and conserve ammunition. Brake hard right or left immediately after passing the train. Never, ever pull up vertically through your own gun smoke, because that's where the flak would be concentrated. He taught these tactics to his pilots in the 55th Fighter Group. Some listened. Some thought they knew better. The casualty rates told their own story. During 1944, pilot losses in fighter groups conducting ground attack operations exceeded 50%. 1 out of every 2 pilots who started the year flying combat missions would be dead, missing, or captured by the year's end. The majority of those losses came during ground attack missions, not air combat. The missions that claimed these pilots had a rhythm that became familiar to anyone who flew them regularly. Morning briefing at 0400 hours. Target area somewhere in eastern Germany or occupied Poland. Weather usually terrible, low clouds and ice. Takeoff in darkness, forming up over England, climbing to 20,000 feet for the flight across the Channel. Then the descent toward the target area, dropping down through cloud layers, breaking into clear air over enemy territory at altitudes where every church steeple represented a collision hazard. The bomber escort portion came first. Heavy bombers, B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds, droning toward their targets in tight formations. The fighters wove above and around them, maintaining position, watching for Luftwaffe interceptors that rarely appeared by early 1945. The German fighter force had been gutted by losses. Fuel shortages kept most aircraft grounded. The threat came from flak now, from 88mm guns that threw walls of explosive steel into the bomber formations. When the bombers reached their targets and turned for home, the fighters were released to hunt. This was when the railroad rodeos began. Flight leaders would take their formations down to low altitude, skimming over forests and fields, following road networks and rail lines, searching for targets. A column of smoke on the horizon might indicate a locomotive. A glint of reflected sunlight might reveal parked trucks. Intelligence reports before the mission had provided areas where traffic was expected, but finding specific targets required visual search. When someone spotted a train, standard procedure called for the flight leader to make the first attack run, while wingmen remained high, watching for flak positions. If the leader survived the first pass, others would follow. If he didn't survive, the flight broke off and searched for easier targets. This tactical caution saved lives, but also meant many trains escaped damage when the first attacking pilot was shot down. Righetti had developed a variation that ignored standard procedure. When he spotted a train, he attacked immediately, regardless of whether flak was visible. His wingman, Lieutenant Colonel Henry, was under orders to follow Righetti's lead rather than hold high position. This aggressive approach maximized damage to German transportation, but also maximized risk. Righetti accepted that risk. He'd been heard to say that war wasn't about following procedures. It was about killing the enemy before they killed you. January 14th, 1945 was a typical railroad rodeo mission for the 55th Fighter Group. The target area was east of Leipzig, prime hunting ground for trains moving supplies toward the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing their final offensive. Weather was clear, temperature well below freezing, visibility excellent. Conditions were perfect for ground attack. Conditions were also perfect for German flak gunners. Righetti's formation consisted of 16 P-51 Mustangs from the 338th Fighter Squadron. They'd escorted B-17 seconds to their target without incident, released on schedule, and descended to begin the hunt. The first train appeared 20 miles southeast of Leipzig, a long freight consist moving west at perhaps 40 miles per hour. Righetti called it out over the radio, brief and professional. "Train at 2 o'clock, 3 miles. Follow me down." The attack run took 12 seconds from initiation to breakaway. Righetti's first burst hit the locomotive's forward section, penetrating the smoke box and probably damaging the boiler tubes. The second burst, 2 seconds later, struck center mass on the boiler itself. The effect was dramatic but not immediate. Steam began venting from multiple rupture points. The locomotive continued moving for another 100 yards before the engineer managed to stop it, probably by dumping the fire and releasing all remaining pressure. One locomotive destroyed. Righetti pulled up, banking to watch the rest of his formation make their runs. 3 more pilots attacked the same train, destroying or damaging several freight cars. Then the formation reformed and continued hunting. Standard procedure. Nothing exceptional about it, except the mathematical precision required to hit a moving target while traveling at 300 miles per hour. 20 minutes later, they found another train. Then, another. By the time they turned for home, Righetti's formation had claimed 8 locomotive kills and multiple damaged rolling stock. Righetti personally accounted for 3 confirmed locomotives destroyed. A good day by any measure. Not extraordinary, just effective execution of tactics he'd helped develop. But here's what makes this mission significant. While Righetti and his formation were hunting trains southeast of Leipzig, other formations from the 55th Fighter Group were conducting similar missions across eastern Germany. The group's mission reports for January 14th show multiple locomotive claims scattered across a wide geographic area. When compiled, the day's total exceeded 30 locomotives destroyed or damaged by 55th Fighter Group pilots. 30 locomotives in a single day. That's the kind of number that might get exaggerated in the retelling. A pilot in a different squadron might hear 30 locomotives and remember it as a single pilot's achievement rather than a group effort. Another pilot might hear the story third hand and round it up to an even more impressive number. By the time the tale circulated through multiple fighter groups, 30 locomotives destroyed by the 55th Fighter Group on January 14th could easily become 1 pilot destroyed 22 locomotives in a single mission. That's probably how the story Locomotives started. Not as a deliberate lie, but as the natural distortion that occurs when extraordinary events get compressed and simplified in the retelling. And the events were extraordinary, just not in the way the exaggerated story suggested. What was extraordinary was the systematic destruction of Germany's transportation network by hundreds of fighter pilots flying thousands of missions over several months. The campaign's scale can be measured in numbers. Between December 1st, 1944 and March 31st, 1945, American fighter groups in the European theatre destroyed or damaged over 8,000 German locomotives. 8,000. The 8th Air Force alone accounted for roughly half that number. Individual fighter groups competed for locomotive kills the way sports teams compete for championships. Unit pride depended on the numbers. The 55th Fighter Group led all 8th Air Force units in confirmed locomotive kills, but other groups came close. The 352nd Fighter Group, the 56th Fighter Group, and the 4th Fighter Group all exceeded 400 confirmed kills. These weren't isolated exceptional missions. This was sustained operational activity that transformed fighter groups from air superiority units into ground attack forces. The transformation happened because the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force by late 1944. German fighter production remained high, factories churned out hundreds of new aircraft each month, but fuel shortages and pilot losses meant most of those aircraft never flew combat missions. Allied fighters roaming over Germany encountered little opposition. The question became what to do with fighter aircraft when there were no enemy fighters to shoot down. General Doolittle's answer was to repurpose them as ground attack platforms. Fighter pilots trained for air combat found themselves strafing locomotives, trucks, barges, and anything else that moved. Some adapted quickly. Others resented the mission as dangerous and beneath their training. Righetti fell into the first category. He'd understood from the beginning that ground attack was where he could make the largest impact on the war's outcome. His reasoning was sound. By January of 1945, Germany's strategic position was hopeless. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, American and British forces from the west. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how long the war would continue and how many people would die before it ended. Anything that accelerated Germany's collapse saved lives on both sides. German military logistics depended entirely on railroads. Road transport required fuel Germany no longer had. Horse-drawn transport was too slow for military operations. Rail was the only way to move divisions, ammunition, food, and what little fuel remained. Destroy the railroads, and German forces couldn't maneuver, couldn't respond to Allied advances, couldn't sustain defensive operations. The Reich would collapse under its own weight. That strategic logic made train strafing missions strategically vital. It didn't make them any less deadly for the pilots flying them. Every railroad rodeo mission carried the possibility of mechanical failure, navigation error, bad weather, or simply bad luck. The flak was omnipresent. The margin for error was non-existent. A pilot who made a single mistake typically didn't get a chance to learn from it. Lieutenant James McCutcheon, of the 55th Fighter Group, learned this on August 13, 1944. His flight had attacked a marshalling yard at Ars, France, southwest of Metz. McCutcheon was flying number 2 position on his flight leader's wing, carrying 2 500-pound bombs intended for oil tank cars. The attack run proceeded normally. McCutcheon followed his leader down, released his bombs, pulled up. Then he disappeared. His flight leader, Captain Lanoy Anderson, never saw what happened. One moment McCutcheon's P-51 was there, pulling out of the dive. The next moment, it was gone. Anderson searched the area, saw no crash, no parachute, no wreckage. The official report listed McCutcheon as missing in action. The probable cause was listed as ground fire during the strafing attack. He was 20 years old. The next day, 2 more 55th Fighter Group pilots died on similar missions. Second Lieutenant William Macmillan pulled up too late while strafing a locomotive near Revigny-sur-Ornain in northeastern France. His P-51 struck the ground at full speed. First Lieutenant Richard Keogh was more fortunate. The locomotive he strafed exploded, and debris damaged his Mustang badly enough to force him to bail out. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. 3 pilots lost in 2 days on ground attack missions. That was the cost of prosecuting the railroad campaign, and August of 1944 was early in the campaign, before the really intensive period began. The casualty rates would get worse as German flak defences improved and as pilots took greater risks to achieve higher locomotive counts. The mathematics of attrition applied equally to both sides. Every locomotive destroyed reduced German transportation capacity. Every pilot lost reduced Allied operational effectiveness. The difference was that America could replace pilots and aircraft faster than Germany could replace locomotives and trained engineers. It was industrial warfare in its purest form, mathematical rather than heroic, grinding rather than glorious. Righetti understood this better than most. He'd studied animal husbandry at California Polytechnic State College before the war, graduating in 1935. He understood breeding programs, productivity metrics, resource management. He could look at casualty reports and see them as data points in a larger equation. If losing 3 pilots destroyed 30 locomotives, and if those 30 locomotives would have transported 300 tons of ammunition to the front, then the trade favoured the Allies. Cold calculation, but accurate. That coldness made him effective as a commander, but also made him unpopular with some of his pilots. They saw him as a glory hunter, a latecomer trying to accumulate medals at their expense. The criticism had some validity. Righetti had arrived at the 55th Fighter Group in October of 1944, when the war in Europe was clearly approaching its conclusion. He was 29 years old, technically too old for fighter operations according to some standards. He had no combat experience. He had everything to prove. Within 3 months, he'd become the group's commanding officer. Within 4 months, he'd become the leading ground attack ace in the 8th Air Force. That kind of rapid advancement bred resentment. Some pilots under his command believed he achieved his numbers by taking unnecessary risks that endangered his wingmen. Others argued he simply executed the mission aggressively and effectively, exactly what the situation demanded. The truth probably included elements of both perspectives. Righetti flew aggressively because aggressive tactics produced results. He took risks because conservative tactics meant targets escaped. He accumulated victories because he flew more missions than anyone else in the group, and because he was genuinely skilled at a mission most pilots found difficult. Whether those factors justified the risks he took, or asked his wingmen to take, remains debatable. What isn't debatable is the impact his leadership had on the 55th Fighter Group's performance. In January of 1945, under Righetti's command, the group destroyed 157 confirmed locomotives, a monthly record that exceeded every other fighter group's performance. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, mentioned Righetti by name in a press release about the group's success. General Doolittle remarked at a conference that he'd heard of Righetti, which in the hierarchy of military praise represented significant recognition. But recognition came with expectations. The 55th Fighter Group had become famous for locomotive destruction. Other groups were trying to surpass their numbers. The pressure to maintain their lead drove operational decisions throughout early 1945. More missions, more risks, more aggressive tactics. The mathematics suggested this approach would eventually produce casualties proportional to the increased operational tempo. February brought changes. On February 22nd, the previous commanding officer of the 55th Fighter Group, Colonel George Crowell, completed his tour and rotated back to the United States. Righetti, despite his short time with the group, was selected to succeed him. At 29, he became one of the youngest group commanders in the 8th Air Force. The promotion came with roughly 2,000 personnel under his command, including pilots, maintenance crews, intelligence staff, security personnel, and logistics specialists. The promotion also meant Righetti could have stopped flying combat missions. Group commanders weren't required to fly operationally. Many chose not to, considering their value as commanders outweighed the risks of combat flying. Righetti made a different calculation. He continued flying missions, leading formations, hunting locomotives. His reasoning was tactical rather than personal. A commander who flew with his men understood their challenges, earned their respect, made better decisions. That reasoning had merit, but it also meant the 55th Fighter Group's commanding officer regularly exposed himself to ground fire while attacking German trains at 100 feet altitude. If Righetti died, the group would lose an experienced commander and suffer disruption at a critical moment in the war. From a purely strategic perspective, his decision to continue flying combat missions was questionable. From a morale perspective, it was brilliant. Pilots who might have resented orders from a desk-bound commander followed Righetti willingly because he led from the front. When he ordered a formation to attack a heavily defended railroad yard, they knew he'd be in the first aircraft through the flak. That kind of leadership inspired loyalty, even among pilots who thought his tactics were too aggressive. March brought peak intensity to the railroad campaign. Soviet forces had broken through German defenses in Poland and were advancing toward Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. Germany's military situation was collapsing, but organized resistance continued. The Wehrmacht still controlled significant territory, still fielded multiple divisions, still required supplies moved by rail. Allied fighter groups intensified their interdiction efforts. Every locomotive destroyed meant fewer supplies reaching German forces. Every freight car set ablaze meant less ammunition for defensive positions. Every rail yard put out of action meant greater chaos in German logistics. The campaign had become a race to paralyze Germany's transportation network before the final ground offensives began. The 55th Fighter Group flew multiple missions daily during March. Morning missions escorted bombers, afternoon missions hunted ground targets. Some pilots flew 3 sorties in a single day. Fatigue accumulated, mechanical issues increased, the accident rate rose. But the locomotive count continued climbing. By the end of March, the group had destroyed over 200 additional locomotives, bringing their total well above 600 confirmed kills. Righetti's personal total reached 27 confirmed ground victories by mid-March, establishing him as the leading strafing ace in the European theatre. His aerial victory tally stood at 7.5, respectable but not exceptional. His reputation rested entirely on his ground attack effectiveness. He'd become Eager L, the aggressive commander who turned the 55th Fighter Group into the most feared locomotive hunters in the 8th Air Force. That reputation was built on 3 months of intense combat operations. 3 months during which Righetti flew dozens of missions into German flak, while his peers accumulated paperwork behind desks. 3 months during which he personally destroyed 27 locomotives, more than entire squadrons accomplished in some groups. 3 months during which he repeatedly demonstrated that aggressive tactics, properly executed, produced results despite the risks. Those 3 months established patterns that would ultimately prove fatal. Righetti's tactics worked because they were aggressive. They produced casualties because they were aggressive. The balance between effectiveness and survival depended on factors beyond any pilot's control. Mechanical reliability, weather conditions, enemy flak positions, luck. Eventually, one or more of those factors would turn against even the most skilled pilot. April 17, 1945, was Righetti's 30th birthday. It was also the second-to-last mission the 55th Fighter Group would fly before the war in Europe ended. The target area was Dresden, a city that had been devastated by Allied bombing 2 months earlier, but remained an important transportation hub. The mission was straightforward: escort heavy bombers to their targets, then hunt for ground targets on the return flight. Righetti took off from Wormingford that morning in Katydid, his P-51D marked with the distinctive green and yellow checkerboard of the 55th Fighter Group. His wingman was Lieutenant Colonel Henry, who'd flown with Righetti on dozens of previous missions. The formation consisted of aircraft from the 338th Fighter Squadron, experienced pilots who knew the risks and accepted them as part of the mission. The bomber escort portion proceeded without incident. The Luftwaffe failed to challenge the formation, as had become typical by April of 1945. German fighters remained grounded by fuel shortages and pilot losses. The real threat came from anti-aircraft fire, which remained lethal throughout the war. The bombers completed their runs and turned for home. Righetti's formation was released to hunt ground targets. Near the town of Riesa, about 20 miles northwest of Dresden, Righetti spotted an airfield with aircraft parked on the ground. This was premium target, far more valuable than locomotives. Parked aircraft couldn't move, couldn't evade, represented complete kills if properly attacked. Righetti made his decision immediately. He ordered the rest of his formation to remain at altitude while he and Henry dove to investigate the airfield's defences. The dive put them below 200 feet, skimming over German countryside at 300 miles per hour. Henry tried to stay in position on Righetti's wing, but the terrain and speed made formation flying nearly impossible. They levelled off, approaching the airfield. Righetti spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 on approach for landing, a target presenting itself with perfect timing. He ordered Henry to engage the landing aircraft while he attacked the parked planes. What happened next remains unclear because Henry lost sight of Righetti after they split to engage separate targets. Henry destroyed the landing Focke-Wulf, then looked for Righetti. He saw nothing. No aircraft, no parachute, no smoke, nothing. He circled the area once, searching. Being alone over enemy territory at low altitude was suicidal, so Henry climbed and rejoined the formation. They returned to England without Righetti. Initial reports suggested Righetti might have landed successfully after taking flak damage. Some pilots reported hearing radio transmission, indicating he was down, but okay. The 55th Fighter Group waited for confirmation that their commanding officer had survived and would return as a prisoner of war. No confirmation came. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Still no word about Righetti's fate. He was officially declared missing in action, later changed to killed in action with the date listed as April 17th, 1945. His body was never recovered. No German records indicated his capture or death. The most likely explanation, based on witness accounts from German civilians, is that Righetti crashed or landed in enemy territory and was killed by civilians enraged at years of Allied bombing and strafing attacks. Such killings were not uncommon in the final months of the war. German civil order had collapsed in many areas. Allied airmen who survived being shot down faced lynch mobs rather than proper prisoner processing. Righetti, if he survived the crash, would have been wearing an American uniform in the middle of Germany during a period when American aircraft were destroying everything that moved. The civilians who found him would have seen only the enemy who'd been killing them for months. His wife Catherine, for whom he'd named his aircraft Katydid, waited for news that never came. His young daughter, barely 2 years old when he left for England, would grow up without her father. His family kept a light burning at their ranch in California, hoping he might somehow find his way home. He never did. The 55th Fighter Group lost its commander 3 weeks before the war ended, gaining nothing strategically from his death. The story of how one pilot supposedly destroyed 22 locomotives in a single strafing run was never verified because it never happened. But the story's persistence reveals something important about the men who flew these missions and the war they fought. They needed stories that made their deaths meaningful, that transformed grinding attrition into individual heroism, that suggested their sacrifices achieved something beyond adding one more number to a statistical report. The real story of locomotive destruction during the final months of World War II in Europe was statistical rather than individual. It was about hundreds of pilots, flying thousands of missions, accumulating thousands of locomotive kills through sustained operations that cost hundreds of lives. It was about industrial capacity applied to transportation interdiction. It was about mathematics rather than heroics. But mathematics doesn't inspire pilots to risk their lives attacking flak-defended trains at 100 feet altitude. Stories about individual pilots destroying 22 locomotives do inspire such risks, even if the stories are exaggerated or entirely fictional. The exaggeration served a purpose. It made bearable what was otherwise unbearable. It transformed senseless deaths into meaningful sacrifices. It gave pilots something to believe in beyond the cold calculation of loss rates and replacement schedules. Righetti understood this, even if he never articulated it explicitly. His aggressive pursuit of locomotive kills, his personal accumulation of ground victories, his visible leadership from the front, all served to inspire his men. They saw their commander diving through flak to destroy trains, and they followed his example. Whether that made strategic sense, or whether it needlessly exposed a valuable commander to risk, became irrelevant when viewed through the lens of morale and unit effectiveness. The 55th Fighter Group's record supports this interpretation. Under Righetti's command, they destroyed more locomotives than any other group in the 8th Air Force. Their pilots flew more aggressively, took more risks, and paid a higher price than many other units. But they also achieved their objectives more consistently. When the ground war reached its climax in April of 1945, German forces found their logistics paralyzed, their supplies interdicted, their ability to maneuver compromised. The 55th Fighter Group and units like them had achieved their mission. That achievement came at a cost measured in missing pilots like Righetti, dead pilots like McCutcheon, captured pilots like Keogh. It came at a cost measured in families that received telegrams informing them their sons or husbands would not be coming home. It came at a cost measured in P-51 Mustangs that crashed into German fields or burned in mid-air after taking flak hits. But the achievement was real, German. Military logistics collapsed in early 1945, partly because Allied fighters had destroyed the transportation network. The strategic importance of the railroad campaign can be measured by comparing German military performance before and after the intensive interdiction period. In December of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces managed to concentrate armor and supplies sufficiently to launch a major offensive. The offensive failed ultimately, but it demonstrated that German logistics still functioned well enough to support large-scale operations. By March of 1945, 3 months into the intensive railroad interdiction campaign, German forces could barely manage local counterattacks. Division-level movements became impossible because trains couldn't move. Army-level coordination broke down because supplies couldn't reach forward positions. The Wehrmacht remained a formidable force at the tactical level, but strategic mobility had ceased to exist. That transformation occurred largely because of missions like the ones Righetti and his pilots flew daily. Each destroyed locomotive removed capacity from the German transportation network. Each damaged freight car reduced the amount of supplies reaching the front. Each burned-out railroad yard created bottlenecks that multiplied the effect of individual attacks. The cumulative impact of thousands of strafing missions paralyzed Germany's ability to wage war. Understanding this requires examining the specific mechanics of how locomotive strafing affected German operations. A typical German freight locomotive could pull a train of 30 to 50 cars, each carrying 10 to 20 tons of supplies. Destroy one locomotive, and 300 to 1,000 tons of cargo didn't reach its destination. That cargo might be ammunition for artillery batteries, fuel for panzer divisions, food for frontline troops, or replacement equipment for damaged units. The absence of that cargo had immediate tactical effects. Artillery batteries conserved shells, reducing the suppressive fire that German infantry relied upon for defense. Panzer divisions remained immobile, unable to counterattack Allied breakthroughs. Frontline troops went hungry, reducing their combat effectiveness. Equipment failures accumulated because replacement parts never arrived. The Wehrmacht began dying from logistical starvation. German attempts to compensate for locomotive losses reveal how critical the transportation network had become. They began moving supplies at night, hoping darkness would protect trains from Allied fighters. This reduced daily capacity significantly because loading and unloading operations slowed in darkness. They dispersed freight across multiple smaller trains rather than running large consists, thinking this would minimize losses if attacked. This reduced efficiency and increased the number of locomotives required for equivalent cargo movement. They mounted anti-aircraft guns on freight cars, as mentioned earlier, hoping mobile flak would deter attacks. This reduced cargo capacity and required diverting scarce flak crews from static defences. They attempted to repair damaged locomotives rapidly, bringing mobile workshops to attack sites. This worked sometimes, but depended on having spare parts that were themselves difficult to transport because the railroad network was compromised. None of these countermeasures proved adequate because the fundamental problem wasn't tactical but mathematical. The Wehrmacht needed to move a certain tonnage of supplies daily to sustain operations. Allied fighters were destroying locomotives faster than German industry could replace them. The mathematics inevitably favored the side that could produce replacement aircraft and pilots faster than the enemy could produce replacement locomotives and trained engineers. By April of 1945, the German railroad system was in collapse. Thousands of locomotives sat damaged or destroyed in rail yards across Germany. Thousands more lacked fuel to operate because petroleum refineries had been bombed into rubble. The engineers and maintenance crews who kept trains running had been conscripted into combat units or killed in Allied attacks. The track itself was pockmarked with craters from bombing and strafing. What remained functional operated at perhaps 30% of capacity compared to 1943 levels. That 30% couldn't support military operations across multiple fronts while also maintaining civilian food distribution. German military commanders faced impossible choices. Allocate scarce transportation to ammunition and fuel, and soldiers went hungry, undermining morale. Allocate transportation to food, and defensive positions ran out of shells, undermining combat effectiveness. Either choice led toward defeat. This was the context in which Righetti's disappearance occurred. The railroad campaign had succeeded strategically. German logistics were paralyzed. The final Allied offensives were achieving breakthrough after breakthrough because German forces couldn't maneuver to plug gaps in their lines. The war would end within weeks, regardless of whether individual American pilots continued attacking trains. Yet Righetti died attacking an airfield 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. His death changed nothing strategically. The 55th Fighter Group continued operations under new leadership. German forces continued collapsing. The war ended on schedule. Righetti's final mission achieved its tactical objectives, destroying 8 parked German aircraft according to reports, but those tactical objectives had become strategically meaningless. This raises uncomfortable questions about the railroad campaign's final phase. At what point did the strategic benefit of continued interdiction operations become insufficient to justify the continuing pilot losses? When German logistics were clearly paralyzed, when the war's outcome was certain, when the end was weeks away, should fighter groups have ceased ground attack missions? The commanders who ordered continued operations would argue that every day the war continued cost Allied lives in ground combat. Anything that accelerated German collapse saved lives even if it cost pilot casualties. They would note that German forces continued fighting effectively at the tactical level despite logistical paralysis. They would point out that nobody knew in April how much longer the war would last. Hindsight suggests weeks, but at the time, estimates ranged from weeks to months. These arguments have merit, but they don't fully address the moral calculation involved in ordering pilots to risk death for marginal strategic gains. Righetti's death, 3 weeks before war's end, suggests the margin had become very thin indeed. Whether that justified the risk he took, or was ordered to take, depends on ethical frameworks that don't have clear answers. What we can say with certainty is that Righetti made his own choice to continue flying combat missions after being promoted to group commander. He could have stayed on the ground, managed operations from a desk, survived the war. He chose differently, for reasons that probably included duty, pride, competitive drive, and genuine belief that his presence in combat made a difference. That choice led directly to his death. His legacy is complex. His pilots remembered him as aggressive to the point of recklessness, as glory-seeking, as demanding. They also remembered him as effective, as courageous, as willing to take risks he asked them to take. The 55th Fighter Group's record under his command speaks for itself. They destroyed more locomotives than any other unit, established themselves as the premier ground attack group in the 8th Air Force, and paid a commensurate price in casualties. Righetti's 27 confirmed ground victories remain the highest total for any 8th Air Force pilot in the ground attack role. No one surpassed his record after his death. The tactics he developed, the aggressive approach he championed, became standard procedure in fighter groups across the theatre. His influence extended beyond his own unit, shaping how the entire 8th Air Force conducted ground attack operations during the war's final months. But influence and achievement don't erase the fundamental tragedy of his story. He was 29 years old, married with a young daughter, a college graduate with his whole life ahead of him. He volunteered for combat, trained intensively, flew across the Atlantic to fight in a war that wasn't directly threatening his home. He excelled at a mission that most pilots found terrifying. And he died 3 weeks before that war ended, in circumstances that remain unclear, probably at the hands of civilians rather than soldiers. His death accomplished nothing strategically that wouldn't have been accomplished if he'd survived. Germany would have surrendered on the same day. The same number of lives would have been saved by ending the war when it ended. His 27 ground victories contributed to that end, but his death did not. It was simply waste, the kind of waste that wars produce regardless of their justification or necessity. The same could be said of James McCutcheon, who died at 20 attacking a marshalling yard in France, or William Macmillan, who pulled up too late after strafing a locomotive, or Richard Keogh, who spent months as a prisoner after his aircraft was damaged, or the hundreds of other fighter pilots who died or were captured during ground attack missions in the final year of the war. Each death was individually tragic, Each was part of a larger strategic campaign that achieved its objectives. The campaign's success doesn't redeem the individual tragedies, but it does place them in context. These men didn't die for nothing. They died in pursuit of objectives that shortened the war and saved lives, overall, even if their individual deaths came too late to matter personally. The story of one pilot destroying 22 locomotives in a single strafing run captures none of this complexity. It suggests individual heroism achieving impossible results through skill and courage. It transforms the grinding mathematics of attrition into a tale of personal achievement. It makes the unbearable bearable by suggesting meaning exists in places where only statistics actually exist. But the real story, the true story, is actually more compelling than the exaggerated version. The real story is about hundreds of pilots flying into flak daily because someone calculated that the losses were acceptable given the strategic gains. It's about commanders like Righetti, who led from the front because they believed visible leadership mattered more than personal survival. It's about young men barely out of high school pointing their fighters at German locomotives and pulling the trigger despite knowing the odds were against them. It's about the P-51 Mustang, a fighter designed for air superiority, being repurposed as a ground attack platform because that's what the strategic situation demanded. It's about machine guns designed to destroy enemy aircraft at 300 yards being used to rupture locomotive boilers at point-blank range. It's about pilots who trained to dogfight, finding themselves learning strafing techniques through trial and error, with error often proving fatal. It's about the German engineers and firemen who kept trains running despite knowing that Allied fighters hunted them daily. It's about German flak crews who mounted anti-aircraft guns on flat cars and waited for American fighters to commit to attack runs. It's about German civilians who worked to repair damaged track and clear wrecked locomotives so supplies could continue moving. It's about industrial warfare at its most pure. American factories produced P-51 seconds faster than German factories produced locomotives. American training programs produced replacement pilots faster than German training programs produced replacement engineers. American logistics delivered ammunition to English air bases faster than German logistics could move supplies to frontline units. The mathematics favored America, and mathematics decided the outcome. The railroad campaign represented the logical endpoint of industrial warfare. Identify the enemy's critical vulnerability. Apply overwhelming force against that vulnerability. Sustain the pressure until the enemy's system collapses. The vulnerability was Germany's railroad network. The force was hundreds of fighter aircraft making thousands of attacks. The result was systemic collapse. Righetti and pilots like him were the instruments of that strategy. They didn't need to destroy 22 locomotives in a single mission. They needed to destroy 2 or 3 locomotives per mission, repeatedly, day after day, until the cumulative effect paralyzed German logistics. They needed to survive long enough to make multiple attacks rather than achieving impossible results on a single sortie. They needed to maintain operational tempo rather than performing individual miracles. This is why the exaggerated story about 22 locomotives matters less than the verified statistics. The 55th Fighter Group destroyed over 600 locomotives total. That number represents thousands of individual missions, hundreds of pilots, months of sustained operations. It represents industrial warfare functioning as designed, grinding down enemy capabilities through attrition. Individual missions were dramatic. Gun camera footage shows locomotives exploding in clouds of steam, freight cars bursting into flames, tracks buckling under the force of impacts. But the drama was incidental to the purpose. The purpose was to destroy capacity, any capacity, all capacity. Whether a pilot destroyed 1 locomotive or 6 on any given mission mattered less than whether pilots continued destroying locomotives day after day. Righetti's 27 ground victories are significant not because 27 is an impressive number in isolation, but because he accumulated them while commanding a group that destroyed over 600 total. His personal achievements scaled across his entire unit. His tactics became their tactics. His aggressiveness became their operating philosophy. His legacy was multiplicative rather than individual. The pilots who flew under his command remember him not for specific missions but for transforming the 55th Fighter Group into an effective ground attack unit. They remember his willingness to attack targets others avoided. They remember his visible presence in combat. They remember that he died doing what he ordered them to do. Those memories shaped how they flew their own missions, how they approached risk, how they calculated acceptable losses. This legacy extended beyond the 55th Fighter Group. Other units adopted Righetti's tactics after seeing the 55th's results. The aggressive approach to train hunting, the willingness to attack despite flak, the emphasis on destroying locomotives rather than simply damaging them. These became standard across the 8th Air Force during early 1945. The railroad campaign's success owed much to tactics Righetti had helped develop and demonstrate. But that success came at terrible cost. The 50% casualty rate among fighter pilots conducting ground attack operations in 1944 represents roughly 1,000 pilots killed, missing, or captured from the 8th Air Force alone. Add the 9th Air Force and RAF losses, and the total exceeds 2,000 Allied pilots lost to ground attack missions. Each loss represented a trained aviator, months of instruction, thousands of dollars in training costs, and a personal tragedy for family and friends. German losses exceeded Allied losses significantly. Thousands of locomotive engineers and firemen died in Allied attacks. Thousands more flak crew died when fighters strafed gun positions. Thousands of civilian railroad workers died repairing track and clearing wreckage. The locomotive boiler explosions that looked so dramatic in gun camera footage killed everyone near the locomotive. The secondary explosions when ammunition cars were hit killed everyone in the vicinity. The strategic calculus suggested these losses were acceptable because they achieved objectives that shortened the war. But acceptable to whom? The pilots who died attacking trains weren't asked whether they accepted the trade. The German civilians killed by those attacks weren't consulted about strategic necessity. The families who received telegrams about missing loved ones didn't participate in the calculations that sent those men to their deaths. Wars create these impossible ethical situations where rational strategic decisions produce irrational human costs. The railroad campaign made perfect sense strategically. Interdicting German logistics accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse and saved lives by shortening the war. But telling that to Catherine Righetti and her daughter doesn't change the fact that their husband and father died 3 weeks before the war ended, achieving nothing they wouldn't have achieved if he'd survived. The story about one pilot destroying 22 locomotives exists partly because it provides an alternative to these uncomfortable truths. It suggests individual agency, personal heroism, meaningful achievement through skill and courage. It's a story that makes sense emotionally, even though it doesn't make sense mathematically. 22 locomotives in one mission is impossible given ammunition capacity, target availability, and engagement time. But it feels like it should be possible for an exceptional pilot making an exceptional effort. That feeling reveals something important about how humans process war. We need stories that suggest our sacrifices matter, individually rather than statistically. We need to believe that exceptional people achieve exceptional results, not that everyone is simply a data point in a larger calculation. We need heroes who accomplish impossible things, not replaceable components in an industrial killing machine. The reality is that modern warfare, industrial warfare, treats everyone as replaceable components. Righetti was an exceptional pilot and commander, but his death didn't change the 55th Fighter Group's effectiveness significantly. They replaced him with another commander and continued operations without missing a beat. His 27 ground victories represented excellent individual performance, but 600 other locomotives would have been destroyed by other pilots if Righetti had never flown a single mission. This doesn't diminish his achievements or his sacrifice, it simply places them in context. He was part of a system that achieved its objectives through mass and sustainability rather than individual brilliance. The system worked because hundreds of pilots like him flew thousands of missions like his, accumulating thousands of locomotive kills through sustained effort rather than singular exceptional performances. The lesson of the railroad campaign isn't that exceptional pilots achieve impossible results. It's that competent pilots achieving ordinary results, repeatedly, over sustained periods, produce strategic effects that no amount of individual heroism can match. Righetti was competent to an exceptional degree, which made him valuable. But his value came from sustained performance rather than peak performance, from dozens of missions rather than one spectacular sortie. This understanding helps explain why the story about 22 locomotives persists despite being false. The story captures an emotional truth, even though it misses the factual truth. The emotional truth is that pilots like Righetti took extraordinary risks and achieved extraordinary results. The factual truth is that those results came from many missions rather than one, from industrial processes rather than individual heroics, from mathematics rather than miracles. Both truths matter. The emotional truth inspires people to take risks that rational calculation would reject. The factual truth enables commanders to plan operations that achieve strategic objectives through sustainable methods. Wars require both emotional commitment and rational planning. Stories about impossible achievements serve the emotional requirement. Statistics about sustainable attrition serve the rational requirement. Righetti embodied both requirements. He flew aggressively, took risks, accumulated impressive personal statistics. That's the emotional truth his legend celebrates. He also flew systematically, trained his pilots in repeatable tactics, commanded a unit that achieved sustained results through dozens of pilots flying hundreds of missions. That's the factual truth that history records. His death on April 17, 1945, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender, represents the ultimate collision between emotional and rational truth. Emotionally, his death was a tragedy that cut short a brilliant career and deprived his family of a husband and father. Rationally, his death was a predictable outcome given the casualty rates for pilots conducting ground attack operations at war's end. The railroad campaign succeeded. German logistics collapsed. The war ended. Allied victory was achieved through exactly the kind of sustained attrition that the campaign represented. Individual deaths like Righetti's were the cost of that victory, calculated in advance, accepted as necessary, and ultimately validated by the strategic results. Whether that makes his death meaningful or meaningless depends on philosophical perspectives that don't have universal answers. What we can say with certainty is that he died believing his missions mattered, his leadership mattered, his example mattered. He flew into flak on his 30th birthday because he believed the railroad campaign was worth the risk. That belief, whether justified or not, was itself consequential because it inspired others to take similar risks. The 55th Fighter Group's record validates that belief pragmatically. They destroyed more locomotives than any other unit, helping to paralyze German logistics during the war's critical final months. Whether individual pilots like Righetti needed to die to achieve those results is unknowable. Different tactics, more conservative approaches, might have achieved similar results with fewer casualties. Or they might not have. War rarely provides controlled experiments to test alternative strategies. What history records is what actually happened. Hundreds of pilots flew thousands of missions attacking German trains. Thousands of locomotives were destroyed. German logistics collapsed. The war ended. Some pilots survived. Many didn't. Their individual fates depended on factors beyond their control, and their deaths meant something different to everyone involved. To their families, their deaths were personal tragedies. To their commanders, their deaths were acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. To historians, their deaths are data points in analysis of the railroad campaign's effectiveness. To the public, their deaths are sometimes forgotten, sometimes commemorated, sometimes transformed into stories about impossible achievements that never actually occurred. The story about one pilot destroying 22 locomotives in a single strafing run belongs to that last category. It's how memory transforms reality into legend, how uncomfortable truths about attrition get replaced by comforting stories about heroism. The story persists because it's easier to remember than the truth. 22 locomotives in one mission makes a better story than 600 locomotives destroyed by dozens of pilots over several months. But the truth is better than the legend. The truth is more complex, more impressive, and more revealing about how modern warfare actually functions. The truth is that the railroad campaign succeeded through sustained effort, industrial capacity, and mathematical superiority, rather than individual miracles. The truth is that pilots like Righetti mattered because they flew many missions, not because they achieved impossible results on one mission. The truth is that wars are won by logistics, production, and attrition, rather than by heroes. But heroes like Righetti matter anyway, because someone has to fly the missions that industrial warfare demands. Someone has to dive through flak to destroy locomotives. Someone has to lead formations into enemy fire. Someone has to die in fields in Germany 3 weeks before the war ends. Elwyn Righetti was that someone. He didn't destroy 22 locomotives in a single mission. He destroyed 27 locomotives over dozens of missions. He commanded a group that destroyed over 600 locomotives. He died pursuing strategic objectives that succeeded despite his death. His story is less dramatic than the legend, but more honest, more important, and more revealing about what victory actually cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.